Hello! I have noticed a distinct lack of Mexican history in English. Probably because it's meant for people who speak Spanish. But most Mexican immigrants can barely speak Spanish anymore. So, I'm here to present you my presentation on Lázaro Cárdenas. So, here for the table of contents really quickly. We have his early life. He was an educated poor person, which led to him becoming socialist, roughly, later on. He rose from a random militiaman to a general with political ties. He became a governor, which was like when he was president, but smaller. He was elected to president, and it went perfectly according to his plan, and was one of the few truly effective presidents. And I will also discuss the aftermath. There we go. So, one thing that makes Lázaro Cárdenas different from so many other Mexican presidents during this time is that he was the only revolutionary leader in my opinion, that was both successful and consistent all throughout his career. In his early life, he was born to a low-class family in Jiquilpan, Michoacán. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Sorry. It's a small state in Mexico, near Mexico City-ish. He lived a poor life, not as poor as those around him, but still incredibly poor. And his father died when he was only 16, which led to him working a lot of jobs earlier than he should have, dropping out of school after only 6 years of schooling, and working various jobs, including, importantly, a tax collector, which is important because it would give him important governmental experience later on, along with showing how he's willing to sacrifice a bit of his social standing, because no one likes the tax man, in exchange for actually helping people. But eventually, he would get a new job as a militiaman during the Mexican Revolution in 1913 against Huerta. So he held leadership positions in a Zapatista militia formed against Huerta, but he would later join Carranza and Obregón and finally Calles before breaking off on his own. These leadership positions were not only as the general leader and captain of his militia, and later on different higher ranks, but also the treasurer, showing how he was able to gather tons of trust around him. Oh, sorry. Look at that. Immaculate. Anyways, he would eventually rise even higher in different militias and general revolutionary armies to become a general, and then leverage those political ties that he gained as general after defeating Huerta, which was this cartoonishly evil dictator. It's a whole thing. But, anyways, he would use his position and collections in high command, along with socialist ideals that he learned from Calles, to become elected to governor of his home state. His home state is about there. You can see it. Michoacán. I still don't know how to pronounce that. And in there, he created the Confederación Revolucionaria Michoacana del Trabajo in order to cement his support among the local populace and stop opposing forces like many reactionary Catholic groups and general discontent forces from taking political power from him when he was governor. When he was governor, he had a few major reforms that he would later apply to his presidency. He redistributed some land and created many ejidos. Think of them as worker co-ops, where people would share the fruits of the labor from land equally between all the people who work there, based on earlier native land organization practices. But apart from that, he would also create many peasant labor organizations, basically unions, in order to stop different oppressing groups from taking power. Not taking power, in order to limit exploitation of peasants and the like. Along with this, he would heavily support education, because one of the many jobs he took while he was young was a teacher. And he would heavily emphasize this role and his love for education as a major step in a soul-enriching process that he wanted to spread to as many people as possible. As part of this, in order to largely pay for it all, he would expand tourism with huge amounts of investments in culture and art. Now, instead of listening to different counselors and expensive advisors, like in many modern political parties, he listened directly to people, avoiding ending up in echo chambers with his lieutenants. After his term as governor, he would run for president. He used his apparent loyalty to Gaius as part of them in order to become governor. You see, Gaius was another important revolutionary figure who, after his first presidential term, created the Maximato, where he would control different presidents as puppets. Using the support he had from Gaius, a 6-year plan inspired from the Soviet 5-year plan, because just as a reminder, World War II was almost happening, just like a few years off from his presidency. And he used his 6-year plan in order to gain support and promise a true future for the people of Mexico. He would also use major amounts of indigenous support. He was kind of like his times Obama, Mexican Obama. He used the fact that he had indigenous ancestry, along with his advanced education and amazing eloquence, in order to appeal to both, racists and indigenous people. Not hardline racists, your grandpa type racists. And he also used his existing revolutionary connections in order to improve his own legitimacy and expand his campaign. He would consistently campaign as if he knew he was going to become president, and offered his plans as more of a technocratic explanation to the people of how he was going to become elected and what he was going to do as president. So, I'm going to cover his general presidency and then go deeper into a few topics later. So, he supported basic labor rights, barely a minimum wage, but for the times, incredibly progressive. He would welcome Spanish refugees, because at the time, Spain was in a civil war with, tons of sides, but two main ones, the Republicans and the Nationalists. And the Republicans shared many of his ideals, so he invited many to come over and share their advanced education, technology, etc. to his own people. But he would also welcome people from basically anywhere. He was very open borders. He would establish a national bank in order to manage the country's finances and to fund many of his later projects, like nationalizing the oil fields. But I'll explain that later. So, many of his socialist leanings, along with Gaius's previous conflicts with the church, led to major unrest between the general populace and himself, along with the general administrative government. So he repealed the Gaius Law, which was meant to restrict the Catholic Church's power in Mexico by limiting the amount of pastors and controlled territory. But in order to do this, he had to end the Maximato, which is mostly behind the scenes. So there isn't a lot of historical records of who he threatened, blackmailed, assassinated, whatever. I don't know, convinced, whatever. I don't know exactly what happened. No one really does. But it ended with Gaius being exiled, and I think he would live either in Europe or the US for the rest of his life. As part of his efforts to end the Maximato, he would take the opportunity to take a hardline anti-corruption stance, cutting down on huge amounts of corruption that occurred in the post-revolutionary government and before. So a major part of his campaign was to spread into rural regions expanding social medicine and rural hygiene, cutting down on the mortality rate, especially the infant mortality rate, all across the country. A major part of what he did, as I alluded to earlier, was he nationalized the oil fields. So, at the time, for most of U.S. history, the U.S. would have never accepted this and would have refused any nationalization outright. But due to FDR's good neighbor policy, he was able to nationalize the oil fields with compensation, costing him a ton, but the people would come out in huge amounts of support to help pay back all the money that he owed in order to nationalize the oil fields. But for a few other socialist ideals, socialist reforms, kind of not limited to the oil nationalization, but also mostly social issues, there was something called the Cristero Revolt, which was basically religious reactionaries trying to limit his influence in the more rural regions of Mexico. But due to him ending the Calles law, he was able to pacify the majority, and those he didn't, he crushed. Another huge economic reform he did was establish a state trading company. You see, he wanted Mexico to have more leverage in trading with other countries, so he would have but a huge amount of Mexican farmers and the like, and Mexican farmers, industry workers, well, not farmers, but not just workers, but the actual industries to support him in the state trading company, meaning they would all trade together, giving them much more leverage in international trade. He then would siphon a lot of the funds from this in order to create public groceries all over Mexico, in places that couldn't really afford to have their own dedicated grocery stores. And these grocery stores had record low, like 45% lower grocery prices than pretty much anywhere else, meaning they would help alleviate the huge amounts of poverty and the like that was plaguing Mexico for pretty much forever, even now. Right, so part of what caused the Cristero Revolt was his attempts to support women's rights. He attempted this. He didn't very much succeed that much due to having to pacify the Cristero Revolt. He had to back off on a lot of his feminist reforms. Again, similar to the organization he founded earlier as governor, he would replace the PNR with the PRM, the modern day PRI, in order to consolidate his control over the government. That was a long slide. Okay, so now on to the big thing. So, Zapatistas, I mentioned them earlier a bit. They are technically still a modern political movement, but historically, they were run by this guy called Emiliano Zapata, and he wanted to redistribute land back to the people because it had been stolen under President Diaz, this hardline military dictator, before Huerta, before all of this, and given to hacendados. They were rich landowners. So Cardenas would end up seizing 49.5 million acres, more than any president before him, from these hacendados, and then redistributed them to the ejidos, which I had explained earlier. There we go. So, a huge amount of his political reforms were related to corporatism. So, essentially, corporatism collectivizes organizations of employees and of employees as corporations, and through corporate state regulates interactions between the two. So practically, what this means is you do get a union, and a big one, but it is state controlled. So, depending on the government, it could be great, it could be terrible, who knows. But it did concentrate a lot of power in the executive, something that other advocates of a corporate state, like Mussolini and major fascist governments, but not just fascist governments, would use in order to consolidate power in themselves. In Mexico, specifically, he would organize the people into four main sectors. Peasants, so farmers basically. Labor, so industry workers. Popular, everyone else. And the military, which was incredibly important to keep under control. He wouldn't be the first Mexican president to be couped. So yeah. Next, one of the biggest things that got the Cristero revolt going was his socialist education. Well, socialist. What he did was he would abolish religious schools, meaning that every school would have to be either a public school or a private school. He forced sex education into the curriculum of every public and private school, which really pissed people off. He would establish the first National Polytechnic Institute in order to educate people, in order to run all these oil extraction operations and mining and the like that, with more technical parts, they used to be done by foreign workers, usually from the US, but not necessarily. And he would do huge amounts of indigenous outreach, expanding education tons. Like, literal tons. Yes. So he wouldn't limit his worker cooperatives to just the farms. He would also expand them to a lesser extent, but still expand them in industry. So he would support labor unions and supported the legal recognition. He would, for example, he wouldn't allow any Mexican equivalent to the Pinkertons. They would just shoot up any striking workers. He promoted cooperation between the state and workers. He promoted cooperation between the state and workers. We wanted everyone to feel together as if they were all part of one. Because they were. They were all part of one large national project to improve the state of Mexico. He instituted laws restricting workers' rights, as I touched on a bit earlier, including the right to strike for better wages, and generally improved working conditions, like an early Mexican equivalent to OSHA. But as part of his corporate state, he would heavily include the government mediating between workers and employers. Long-term effects. So, a lot of this would play into the future allowing labor, peasants, all the different sections I talked about earlier to work together, though it was incredibly fragile and would lead to huge amounts of corruption later on. And so he wouldn't just nationalize the oil fields. He nationalized many industries, especially raw resources, like mining, for example, and fishing. He would encourage huge amounts of worker participation and managing these resources, kind of like what I mentioned earlier with the re-education in the National Polytechnic Institute. Yeah. So he created a state corporation to manage the oil called Pemex. If you've ever been to Mexico, you've seen them pretty much everywhere. It became this huge symbol of worker-state cooperation and help maintain stability in the country that had just gotten, well, not just, but had been in huge civil war for decades, only a single decade ago. Not a single, but a bit over a decade ago. Okay. You see, he wouldn't go unchallenged through all of this by just the Cristeros. He faced other opposition, like from General Cedillo, the Lord of San Luis Potosí. You see, he was a caudillo, which is basically a powerful general. and joined the revolution in 1912 before Lazaro did himself. And he would stay as governor he would become governor of San Luis Potosí, this little area here. And he would stay that way from 1927 to 1931. But he wasn't originally antagonistic towards Cardenas. He would be the Secretary of Agriculture from 35 to 37. But he was anti the agrarian reform, anti-nationalization, anti anything he thought he considered a socialist reform, and built up this huge rural support base. Because, generally in the rural areas, people were more religious and less educated, allowing him to gather huge amounts of support. But he died in 1939, marking the end of Caudillo's holding major political influence in Mexico. Well, for a while. Depending on how you consider cartels. Right, so, the aftermath of his presidency. After he was president, he continued a peaceful transition to power, which was a good precedent to set, stopping any future political conflict, direct political conflict. But the country would continue to steer more conservative and libertarian in its policies, leading to more democratization, but also more inequality over time, due to the lack of the force of his personality to be there constantly. And he also kept a humble legacy of anti-corruption. He would stay modest, living a modest life as he retired. Well, retired. He was still in politics for a while, just not as powerful and as president. He also had his the next person after him, continued his positive relations with the U.S., as I mentioned earlier, with FDR and the Good Neighbor policy, which will lead to Mexico's intervening in the Second World War. I hate the word war. And would continue good relations with the U.S. for a long, long time. But like his namesake Lazarus, his name would be revived. Well, his name would be revived over and over, of whoever was using his face and name for their political goals, aims, whatever. And I believe that is everything. Thanks to SlidesGo for their nice template. And originally, it was for Dia de los Muertos. Not sure if it's gendered or not. So, or how it's gendered. Yeah, so that is everything. Goodbye.